My son didn't talk to me for 2 years after he went to live with his grandparents. And then one ordinary afternoon, he just came home. My name is Diane, I'm 38, and I live in Sacramento. 2 years ago my husband Brian died in a car accident on a Tuesday night, and within a week of his funeral, my 14-year-old son Tyler packed a bag and moved in with Brian's parents. He didn't say goodbye when he left. He didn't really say anything to me at all, not that day and not for 2 years after. Brian and I had been married for 16 years. We had our problems like any couple does, but nothing that ever felt like it was leading anywhere serious. That Tuesday night we had an argument before he left the house, not a huge one, just the kind of tired, frustrated argument that happens between two people who have been together a long time and know exactly which words land the hardest. He left angry. A few hours later I got a call telling me there had been an accident, and that he hadn't survived it. I want to be honest with you about what happened in the days right after that, because it matters for everything that came later. Brian's parents arrived the morning after the accident, and from the very first conversation, something in the way they looked at me had changed. It wasn't anything they said directly, not at first. It was smaller than that, the way a sentence would trail off when I walked into the room, the way they'd go quiet if I asked a question about the accident, the way Brian's mother held Tyler a little too tightly, like she was protecting him from something, or from someone. By the end of that week, Tyler had stopped speaking to me entirely. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't answer when I said his name. And then, 6 days after the funeral, his grandmother sat down with me and said that Tyler had asked to stay with them for a while, that he needed some space, that this wasn't about me, it was just what he needed right now. I let him go. I think back on that decision more than almost anything else in my life, whether I should have fought harder, whether I should have refused, whether there was a version of that week where I held on to my son instead of letting him walk out the door with a duffel bag while I stood in the kitchen trying not to fall apart in front of him. But I was barely holding myself together. I had just lost my husband. And every instinct I had told me that if my son needed space, the worst thing I could do was force him to stay somewhere he didn't want to be. I thought it would be temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month. It became 2 years. For 2 years, Tyler lived about 15 minutes away, in the house where Brian grew up, and I had almost no access to him at all. I would see him at school events sometimes, a holiday concert, an award ceremony, and he would be sitting with his grandparents, and I would sit a few rows back, and he would never once turn around. I tried calling. The calls went unanswered. I tried texting on his birthday, on holidays, just simple messages saying I loved him and was thinking of him. I never got a response. I asked Brian's parents, more than once, what was going on, why Tyler wouldn't speak to me, what I had done. They were always vague. They said he needed time. They said grief works differently for everyone. They said I shouldn't push him. And because I was drowning in my own grief, because I had no idea how to fight a battle I couldn't even see the shape of, I didn't push. I grieved my husband completely alone, in a house that used to have a teenager in it, and I told myself that someday Tyler would come back when he was ready, and that the only thing I could do until then was wait. 2 years passed like that. 2 years of silence, 2 years of empty holidays, 2 years of driving past his school and wondering what he looked like now, whether he'd gotten taller, whether he still liked the things he used to like. And then, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in October, I heard a knock on my front door. I opened the door and Tyler was standing there. 16 now, taller than I remembered, wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. He looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen on him since he was small. For a second neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Can I come in?" I stepped back and let him through, and we stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd watched him walk out 2 years earlier with a duffel bag. He didn't sit down right away. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, and then he looked up at me and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." I told him I would. He said, "Why didn't you ever tell me Dad was with someone else that night? Why didn't you tell me he was drunk?" I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. I asked him how he knew that. He told me. A few weeks earlier he'd been at a friend's house, and the friend's father was a police officer, the same officer, it turned out, who had responded to Brian's accident 2 years ago. They'd been talking, just casually, and somehow the conversation had turned to old cases, and the officer had mentioned the accident without realizing Tyler was Brian's son. He'd talked about the toxicology report. He'd talked about the route Brian had been driving, which wasn't the route home from our house. It was the route from an apartment complex on the other side of town, one the officer recognized because he'd been called there before for a domestic dispute involving a different case, years earlier, and he happened to remember the address because of that. Tyler had gone quiet, and the officer had eventually realized who he was talking to, and the conversation had stopped there. But Tyler had already heard enough. He'd spent the next few weeks putting it together on his own. He looked up the accident report, which was public record. He found Brian's blood alcohol level. He found the address from the route, and eventually, carefully, quietly, he found out whose apartment it was. And then he said the thing that broke me. He said, "Grandma and Grandpa knew. Didn't they?" I didn't answer right away, because I didn't want to be the one to confirm it, but he was looking at me with an expression that told me he already knew the answer, and that what he needed from me wasn't information anymore. It was honesty. I told him yes. I told him that in the days after the accident, before any of us had really processed what had happened, his grandparents had found out about the affair, I think from a friend of Brian's, someone who felt they needed to know, and that instead of that information going anywhere, it had just disappeared into the house with them. I told him I think, in their grief, blaming me was simpler. It let them keep an image of their son intact. It gave them somewhere to put an unbearable feeling. And I told him I never said anything to him about it myself because I didn't want him to lose his father twice, once to the accident, and once to the truth about who he'd been in his last hours. I thought I was protecting him. Tyler stood there for a long moment, and then his face did something I hadn't seen in 2 years. It crumpled, the way a much younger kid's face crumples, and he said, "I've hated you for 2 years for something you didn't do." I told him he didn't know. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he'd been 14 and grieving and the people he trusted most had let him believe something that wasn't true, and that none of that was something a kid should have to carry. He said, "I should have asked you. I should have asked you a long time ago." I told him he was asking now, and that was what mattered. He came around the kitchen island and hugged me, the kind of hug he hadn't given me since he was small, and I held onto him and didn't say anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said right then. Eventually he pulled back and wiped his face and said, "Can I stay here tonight?" I said, "Your room's exactly how you left it." He nodded, and picked up the bag he dropped by the door, the same kind of duffel bag, I noticed, that he'd carried out 2 years before, and carried it down the hall toward his room.